Lord, thank you for the time that we have together here, and thank you for bringing us together. Just a chance for us to dig into your words, hear from you, talk about the things that are important in your words, the way they impact our lives, Lord. Pray that you, the way that draws us closer to you, helps us walk more and impact our world, the world around us for you, God. Pray this. Amen. All right. We're going to start off in 1 Samuel 14. 1 Samuel 14 is where we're going to start off. This little section in 1 Samuel 13, 14, 15 really shows the reason and the beginning, or the peak. No, that's not the right word, not the peak. But the reason Saul will no longer be king. Okay, so we see that in these three chapters. In chapter 13, we saw last time Saul's disobedience to God in not waiting for Samuel to come, and because of that, the consequence was that his dynasty would not continue. In chapter 14, what we're going to see tonight is this contrast between him and his son Jonathan, and just how foolish he was in leadership. Just what not only is he a bad, a wicked person in that he's not walking in obedience to God, he's doing things his own way, but he's just a bad leader as well. And that's a horrible combination, to have a horrible person and a horrible leader. And then tonight we're also going to jump into 15. That's where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. Chapter 15, we're going to see that not only will Saul's descendants not be king, but God's approval of Saul's reign is done. It's come to a finish because God rejects Saul as king because Saul has rejected God and his role. So the first thing we're going to see is this contrast in chapter 14 between Saul and Jonathan. In chapter 14, what we see is how they each relate to God. What we're going to see tonight is Saul brings God dishonor. Saul has rejected God. His way of relating to God is, I don't need you now. I have no use for you at the moment. And so he refuses to do what God says unless it makes sense to him, unless it's on his time. But Jonathan, what we see is, we saw last week that Jonathan won, last time we saw Jonathan won that battle because he was trusting in God. Tonight we're going to see he wins another battle. And we see how he's respected, how he brings God honor through his character and his obedience, and he seeks God's guidance. So let's take a look at Jonathan's strong leadership, and essentially what the author is doing here of 1 Samuel. What the author is doing is telling us, he's not giving us a history lesson per se. He's not laying out a timeline of Saul's reign as king. He's presenting events to show us why things happen, to show us the spiritual implication. And so what we see in chapter 14 is we have a contrast here between Jonathan's strong leadership and Saul's foolish leadership. And so Jonathan's strong leadership, he looks more like a king than Saul does. If you read this chapter, we're not going to read it all, but what he does is he takes his armor bearer, which is his trusted, his second, as you would say in other cultures and other times. He takes that one that is by his side that he trusts most, and what they do, they seek God's wisdom, and they go and defeat an outpost of 20 Philistines. The two of them defeat 20 Philistines. Look at verse 6 of chapter 14 with me. Jonathan said to the young man who was carrying his armor, Come and let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us, for the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few. So as we read that, what's the source of Jonathan's confidence? Look at verse 6 there. Why is Jonathan confident about this? Okay, perhaps the Lord will work for us. Let's ask God. Let's seek out God. What we see in later verses is they say, "Okay, God, um, if this happens, then we'll know that you're giving us the victory. If this set of circumstances happen, and that does, they have the victory." Okay, so he's dependent on God. What else do you see here? Okay, so it's God's victory, not his. Okay, so he's not confident in himself. He's not confident in his own skill level. Look at that last part of the verse there. Perhaps the Lord will work for us. For the Lord is not constrained to save by many or by few. What does he mean by that? The Lord is not constrained to save by many or by few. Okay? He doesn't have to outnumber who they're going against because he's God. He doesn't have to have the upper hand in a military status because God is fighting for him. God is fighting the battle. If you remember back to chapter 13, if you go back and read chapter 13, you'll remember that Saul panicked and disobeyed God because his numbers were dwindling. He went from 2,000 men down to 600 men, and he was panicking. If you read the book of Judges, 600 men is twice what Gideon had to win a major battle. He only had 300 men. God whittled it down, 300. Or Jonathan only has 2 of them, him and his armor bearer, and they went up against 20. So later in the chapter, what we see is Jonathan was wrongly accused and may face the death penalty because of that. Okay, there's a whole set of circumstances that we're not going to dig into all the aspects of chapter 14 because there's just too many of them. But he may face the death penalty. But because the men of the army could trust him, they had confidence in Jonathan. And so they came to his side, they supported him, they defended him, and his life was spared. Jonathan had the leadership skills that the men looked up to. What happened with Saul? Men turned, they hid, they fled. So next, let's take a look at Saul's foolish leadership. Saul's foolish leadership. Okay, so basically what we see here, and we're going to see this continue on, Saul is once again jealous of Jonathan's victory. In chapter 13, we saw that. Jonathan wins a victory, and Saul proclaims to the world, "Look at this victory I have won." In chapter 14, we see it again. Jonathan defeats this garrison of the Philistines, and he's jealous. Later on, hey, Alyssa, come on in. Hey, Julie, Kristen, come on in, y'all. Get all set. We're in 1 Samuel 14 is where we are. Oh, the welcome committee came back to see you, huh? And so we see Saul just turning to foolishness. Saul just turning away from wisdom, and everything plummets real quick. Essentially, what he's trying to do here is he's doing everything he can be to try to regain his relevance. He's trying to regain. He's like that social media person, that influencer that lost their influence, and what do I have to do to get everyone to look at me again? How can I get everyone to turn back to me? So first thing we see is he stopped seeking God. We actually read in this chapter that he told the spiritual advisor that he had, the priest that was there with him, to no longer seek God. Okay, stop asking God about this. We're just going to move forward. Okay, he says, no, take your hand away. No longer seek God. And the second thing we see is Saul makes this oath, or this because he's king, he kind of throw out these random expectations for the entire army. That's what he does. In chapter 14, we see that he made a rule for the army. No one in the entire army can eat anything until I have avenged my enemy. That's what he says. He makes it all about him because that's what he is. Look at verse 24. He says, "Now the men of Israel were hard pressed on that day, for Saul had just put the people under an oath, saying, 'Cursed be the man who eats food before evening, and until I have avenged myself on my enemies.'" I'm sorry. So none of the people tasted food. Okay, so you have this army fighting in a fierce battle with their sworn enemy, the Philistines. Okay, they're fighting in this heated battle. What's the instruction he gives? Don't eat anything. What's that going to do to the men? They're going to, first they're going to be mad. They're going to be hangry, and they're going to be like, maybe I'll fight harder. Then what's it going to do? Pretty quick. They're going to get hungry. They're going to get weak, right? So here's Saul's instruction was foolish. Here's a couple of reasons why. One, it put the men at risk. Okay, he endangered his army because they weren't sufficiently able to defend themselves. They couldn't defend themselves sufficiently. It kept them from victory. If you remember when Samuel went to anoint Saul, he said, "God has appointed you to be the one to bring total victory over the Philistines." Okay, we read that chapter 9. Saul, you're the one that God will use to bring complete victory over the Philistines. He prevented the army from practically being able to do that. This should have been a total victory. Hey, Max. And because of this same instruction he gave everybody, the word, because Jonathan wasn't with the guys at the time, Jonathan didn't know. He comes back, he has some honey. He says, like, "Guys, why you look so weak? Have some honey." "No, your dad said we can't." "Oh, I didn't know that. Look at me. I have strength. I'm going to go fight. What's the matter? Come on, eat." And because of that, Saul said, "Whoever has broken the oath I made must be put to death." And they discovered it was Jonathan. And Saul was ready to kill his son. Why? Because he wanted to avenge himself of his enemies. He wanted to be the one in the spotlight again. He's trying to draw all the attention to himself. Finally, we look in verse 37. You see that it says, Saul inquired of God. Okay, they're at another stage of the battle, and Saul inquired of God, "Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel?" So he's asking God, "Will you give them into the hand of Israel?" And what's God's response? Let me look at the end of verse 37. Yeah, he gets no response. God does not answer him on that day. Why? Why do you think God needs to answer Saul? Okay, because of the reason he's asking? Is that what you're saying? Because the way he's asking, or the motive behind it? Okay. Okay. So you're saying Saul is saying, "What's in this for me?" Okay, good. Good. What else? Okay, turn to God as a last resort. Okay, this isn't working. The men are ticked. They're starving. God, you're my last hope. What else? Why is God not choosing to answer? So Max, we're in 1 Samuel 14 at Psalm. Oh, it was okay. What? Okay, okay. So the kind of different from Gerstein's answer, but kind of this, kind of relates to it. We also have a king who's just living for himself. He does, yeah, he doesn't care really what God says, other than to put on a show, other than to look the part, other than So the motive in asking, kind of going back to Gerstein's thing, the motive in asking is wrong, but also we have a disobedience level in Saul. We have a continual cycle of disobedience, of pride in Saul's life. So we see this downward progression in Saul during his reign, and Saul's put in direct contrast. So what the author of 1 Samuel is doing is, okay, Saul has been raised to king because what the people say, we must have a king now. Saul is now king. Saul became king, but he wasn't a good king. And so what we see is this contrast between Saul and at first we see the contrast between Saul and Samuel and their level of following God. Then we see this contrast here between Saul and Jonathan. For the rest of the book, we're going to see this contrast between Saul and David. And basically what we're seeing is, okay, God, you knew what you were doing when you took Saul out. Okay, we see your case. You've made it clear of why it was necessary for Saul to not sit on the throne. All right, so chapter 15, we're jumping over to chapter 15 now. So in chapter 14, we see this contrast in the character of Saul and Jonathan. In chapter 15, we see Saul ultimately rejected as the king. And the first thing we see is God's instruction. Look at the first couple verses of chapter 15. We're going to dig into this one just a little more. Samuel said to Saul, okay, so Samuel is now giving Saul an instruction. Remember in verse 37, he inquired of God about a specific thing, and God said nothing. God did not answer him. Now God has sent Saul to him, and listen to what he says. Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord said to me to anoint you as king over Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. I now have a message for you from God." Message from God came in God's time, not in Saul. And he reminds him, who made you king? Yeah, the one who's king over you. You expect all your armies, you expect all your citizens to obey you. See if you will walk in obedience to God. And so in verse 1, he reminds him of that. Thus says the Lord in verse 2, thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. Amalek is a people group in that region where the Israelites are now settled and living. Now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has, and do not spare him. Okay? Not Amalek is not a person here, it's a people group. Okay? Do not spare him. Put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So he was looking for God's direction earlier. Now he gets very clear direction from God in verse 3, right? Is there any doubt about what the assignment is in verse 3? But we read this, and this does cause some It seems extreme to some. Read what we just read, that God would give that instruction. It raises some questions for some. So I want to touch on that tonight. And so I want to do a little focus time. Is God a cruel God? Because you read verse 3. Let me read this again. And if you're trying to criticize the Bible, would you jump here and say, look, where's the loving God? Where's the merciful God? Where's the patient God? Let me read verse 3 again. Now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has, and do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So we tell people we serve a God who's a loving God. We serve a God who cares. We serve a God who's compassionate and mercy. But some say this sounds more violent. It sounds more brutal than it does loving. Let's look at some questions about God. What kind of questions would? How many of you have someone in your life that you've talked to, that you're in somewhat contact with, that's somewhat critical of the Bible? What kind of questions would that person have? Or what kind of challenges would they raise to you and say, see, based on that instruction God has given? Because I want to kind of dive into this dilemma here, because I don't want you to get caught off guard if someone does come and says, well, look what God said. You said he was loving. Clearly not. Take a look at this. See, is God cruel? God loving. So what kind of objections or concerns would this raise? Okay. Okay. So you're getting good, great point. But let's look at the objections first, Gabby. Okay. Why kill the innocent women and children? And Gersten, you're right on track, and we're going to get to that part. But let's look at the struggle that goes on in people's mind first. So the women and children, they were innocent. Okay, I understand army against army, soldier against soldier, but women and children? Right. Yep, exactly. And that's and we're going to go there too. Let's keep going with any other objections or any other questions that you think you might face, and then we'll get to both those. Okay. Oh yeah. Why does he jump to death? Why doesn't he give them a chance? Why doesn't he give them a shot? Okay. So are these questions that you could hear someone asking, and people have asked? I wrote down a couple others here. How can we be expected to worship a God who treats people like this? Why would you want me to? Why would you challenge me to this kind of God? Kirsten? Yeah, we know who you mean. Yeah. Exactly. And that's where you're the answer guy, not the question guy, aren't But they're very good answers. Okay, so we're going to get to that. That's the next point here. But let me throw out one or two more questions just to get kind of fill out this dilemma here and these questions that come up. Why is God so harsh? Why isn't He merciful? Why would He order the killing of innocent children, like Gabby said? So let's look at some truths here. And the first one is Kirsten's point he just made there. These actually weren't innocent people. The Amalekites were not innocent. You look at the entirety of the inhabitants of the land that God was bringing the Israelites to. Okay, that whole people group there, all those people groups there, were not an innocent people group that well, God just wants their land, so He's going to kick them out. How mean of God? No, God explains that. This is a wicked people. This culture of this area was wicked. They, as they conquered the land, two things were happening. First, God was fulfilling His promise to Abraham. He says, "There's a land I'm going to give you," and God was fulfilling that promise that He made to Abraham through Joshua and Abraham's son. So that's the first thing. God was giving them the land. Second thing, God was bringing judgment on a morally and spiritually corrupt people. This culture was steeped in child sacrifice. Okay, they would take infant children and throw them on a burning altar as a sacrifice to their god Moloch. They were steeped in witchcraft. They were steeped in prostitution. This was a horribly wicked, perverse people. Before Israel entered the land, God warned them and told them that why the land would be judged. Here's a couple passages in Leviticus 18. He says, "For by all these nations which I'm casting out before you, all these nations I'm casting out before you in the land that you're going into, they have become defiled." Verse 25 of Leviticus 18. "For the land has become defiled, therefore I brought its punishment upon it. So the land has spewed out its inhabitants." God makes it clear before they even step foot into the land. This whole land is defiled. The people are defiled. So the Amalekites were part of this people group, and so none of them were innocent. They had all rebelled against God, but the Amalekites especially, and Gerstein alluded to that a little bit, shortly after Israel left Egypt. You may remember there was a battle they fought. And this is the battle where Moses observed the battle from the top of the hill. And remember what happened? He's watching, and when his hands are raised, what happened? Israelites win. When his hands get tired and they fall down, what happens? Israelites lose. That battle was against the Amalekites. That battle was against the Amalekites, and God made this promise. Here's how the battle started. Well, let me do this one first. Exodus 17. The Lord said to Moses, "Write this in a book." This is right after that. Yeah, right after that battle. The Lord said to Moses, "Write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua." Essentially, pass this down from generation to generation, because here's my promise: I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Okay? Why was God so angry? Why was God so angry in this situation? Why was He so angry with this people? Moses explains before they enter the promised land. He explains to the next generation what their parents and grandparents faced right after they had left Egypt. They're wandering in the wilderness. They haven't even gotten the Ten Commandments yet. That's how early on in the wandering this is. And so they're not even anywhere near the land of the Amalekites. But in Deuteronomy 25, it says, "Remember what Amalek did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt, how he met you along the way and attacked you, and attacked among you all the stragglers at your rear when you were faint, weary, did not hear. So here they are. They're wandering in the wilderness. The Amalekites go to them, go hunt them down, and then start picking them off from the rear. The people who are worn out, the people who are elderly, the people who are malnourished or thirsty or dragging behind because they got injured or whatever. They start picking them off from behind. That's how this whole battle ensues. The Amalekites were not an innocent people. And these events take place about 500 years before, 400 or 500 years before what we're reading here in 1 Samuel. Man, you're like, did you read my notes? Right? All over it. Yep, exactly. And they're not done sin. They haven't reached the point of sinning yet that I will punish them. But again, that's 400 years before they attacked the Israelites coming out of Egypt. And now here we are 400 or 500 years later. So we're talking about a people group that 800 or 900 years previous, God's already saying that to Abraham about them. They're a wicked, sinful people. Remember Sodom and Gomorrah? They're a wicked, sinful people in that land, but they have not used up they have not reached the point of sin that I'm going to take them out yet. Second thing here, the Amalekites had the opportunity to escape and to change. So before they entered the promised land, God, it's interesting. I didn't realize this until this week when I was studying for this. God had given the Israelites some rules of engagement, rules of battle engagement that they were to follow. When they went into a city, they were first to offer peace, and that's in Deuteronomy 20. They were to offer people an opportunity. If you're not our enemy, you can leave. If you are, stay here and fight us. We'll take you on. Deuteronomy 20 verse 10 says, when you approach to fight a city against it, you shall offer terms of peace. That was Israel's instruction in going into the land. So there's this upfront thing where here's our first step anytime we encounter someone, is to offer an opportunity for peace. God gives an opportunity for anyone who's willing to turn to him. Remember in Joshua chapter 6, God is going to wipe out all of this whole fortress of Jericho, the impenetrable walled fortress of Jericho. And what was the instruction he gave the army? Don't take anything. Someone did, a judge. But he goes, God's saying, this is a wicked people, a wicked city. I'm going to completely wipe it out. But is that what ended up happening? Was there one family that survived that? How did they survive that? Rahab had faith in God. She turned to God and she was saved. God isn't out to bring judgment. God's out to bring redemption. But for those who reject it, he will bring judgment when it's needed. And that's what we see. First, the Israelites are giving the Amalekites, and we see they go to this neighboring people group, the Kenites, and they're like, it's going to get messy here. There's going to be some battle going down here. Y'all might want to just clear out give us a couple days here, and then feel free to come back. So y'all might want to just go on home. go on about your business somewhere else and come back, and we just don't want any unnecessary casualties. And the people did; they left. But God's not looking to get back at people. Look at Jonah. Remember the prophet Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh because he hated them. That it was a wicked, horrible people group. They would torture. They would send raiding armies in from the north into northern Israel, and they would torture people. I mean, terribly. They were horrible people, and so they had about the nature of the relationship between Israel and Assyria is probably like the current relationship between Palestinians and Israel. Okay, that kind of warm fuzzy is about what was going on there. And God said, Jonah, the message for Nineveh is the capital city, huge city. The message for Nineveh is repent or I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to wipe you out off of the face of the earth. Did Nineveh get destroyed in that occurrence? No. Why? Because they turned to God. God is not out to get anyone. He's out to redeem. And that's what we see here. The Amalekites had, like we just said, they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to turn to God. But then instead they tried to continue to try to destroy Israel. And that would continue into the future also. In 1 Samuel 30, at the end of this book, in 1 Samuel chapter 30, we read that the Amalekites came in while the army was out. The Amalekites came into one of the Israelite cities, and they burned the city to the ground. They took captive every woman, every child, every infant. They took them as captives. So this was a remnant of the Amalekites that was still hanging around. About 500 years later, as Gerstein mentioned in Esther chapter 3, we read about this guy named Haman, and it describes him as the Agagite. Who's the king of the Amalekites? Agag. So who does that make Haman a descendant of? Agag. Agagite. Sounds like someone who goes to college, Texas, right? So 500 years later, what's Haman's goal in the book of Esther? Kill all the Jews. And what were you saying, Esther? Yep, he hated Mordecai. Essentially, he hated all the Jews too, and and so his goal was to continue that legacy of his people. He nearly succeeded because the law was passed that would have allowed the elimination of basically all of Israel, all the Jews of that day. But through the circumstances of the book of Esther, that did not happen. Last concept I have on this, then we'll get back to the rest of chapter 15. We presume that if something's wrong for us, it's wrong for God. It would be wrong for me to kill women, children who are not fighting in battle against me. Does that make it wrong for God to bring judgment on them? God's the only one that can give life. So God's the only one that's qualified to determine life should end. Women and children there had ample opportunity to leave. One, they were warned. Two, they knew there was this battle raging, and so they had this warning. They had this time. Not only that, they had time to turn to God. They had time to turn away from their wicked lifestyle. Think about it. If there were armies marching toward our house tonight. We're all here. If they're not really my enemy, if I don't really have something against them, you know what? It's not worth it for me to stay here. I'm gonna bug out. The only reason I'm staying here is if their goal is to eliminate, and I'm going to stay and fight because now I have an obligation to try to eliminate them. So the only women and children that would have been there are those who are being trained and poured into and, I guess, indoctrinated with this hatred toward Israel. We see it today. Sometimes you see video clips of some of the terrorist groups, and they're out in the desert with their guns, and they're just shooting them in the air. They're doing these training exercises and stuff like that. You see little clips of it and stuff like that. Sometimes there's these little kids there. You go, what's that guy? That kid 6 or 8? What in the world is going on? What is going on with that kid? Did the kid voluntarily sign up for that, or has that kid been brought into that whole belief system? That's what we do. This is how we treat those who aren't like us. So the only kids that would still be there in this are those whose parents are saying, let me show you how this is done. God sees the hearts of the parents. God sees them, how the minds of the children are being trained for hatred and destruction. And God is the only one who knows when judgment is right. God knows when the right time for judgment is. You know why? Because God alone sees the heart. Have you ever been ready for someone to get judgment way before God was ready? Like, okay, God, and now. Okay. You know what? God's patient. Good. You see God being patient for thousands, hundreds, and over 1,000 years from time span to time span, from the time God promised the land to Abraham and said there's wicked people in the land, to the time Haman and Esther. That's 1,500 years plus. Right? Not quite that much. Over 1,000 years. That's a long time for this hatred, for this desire to destroy another people go on. God's desire is to redeem people. Those who reject Him will face judgment. That's what we see here. Okay, so let's go back to chapter 15. So we see God's instruction for this battle is extreme. But did we kind of deal with that question? Is God cruel? Did you feel like we got some traction on that? And you kind of have, how many of you feel like you might be able to have a conversation with someone who says, but look at what God instructed Israel? That's my goal. Is I want you to be able to interact with someone. Well, no, that's not really true. Because one, they want to God had given them free. They had future opportunities to do the right thing, and they did the wrong. Right. Well, is God going to control every sinful act? No. He's not going to stop every sinful act and you should be glad for that, because you wouldn't have made it past the first day of your life. Okay, so we always point the finger and look at someone else who's more extreme than us that we think. But sin is sin, right? All right, let's look at Saul's partial obedience here. So God gave a very clear instruction. We saw the instruction. We didn't have any, I don't think any of us had any trouble understanding the instruction. But Saul's actions didn't match the instructions. Look at chapter 15, verse 8. Verse 8 says, he captured Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But, okay, so you might say, wait, he destroyed everybody. How were there still people in 1 Samuel 30? How was Haman still around? Well, some of the people did leave. Some they're still part of that nation. They're still Amalekites, but some of them weren't there. They destroyed everyone who was there, but not every person. So it's not a contradiction that it says he utterly destroyed everyone, but there's still some hanging around because they can't defeat people who aren't there. Okay, so verse 8, we utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword, but Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were not willing to destroy them utterly, but everything despised and worthless that they utterly destroyed. So, good job, Saul. You guys won the battle, but in doing so, he didn't obey God. So let's take a look here. Take a look at a couple questions here. What was their criteria that we just read? Verses we just read, verses 8 and 9. What was their criteria for what they kept and what they didn't keep? Okay, this is useless to us. Okay, any other feedback? Yeah, they kept what was valuable to them and got rid of what had no value to them. Okay, so how is that different from God's criteria? Destroy it all. Okay, so don't keep any of it. You remember when the Israelites first entered the Promised Land and Joshua was leading them, and they defeat Jericho, and they're like, "We are invincible. Let's only send a few people to go take on Ai. That's a small little town. We beat Jericho. No one can take us." And they get whooped. Why? Because they didn't fully follow God's instruction. That's what happens. So Saul's reasoning is good. Somebody who asked me. Saul's reasoning was legitimate. I think you've answered already. What's that? Okay, so you're thinking they didn't really intend to sacrifice them. Okay. 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 What if they really did intend to sacrifice? Okay, here's the question. Is the reasoning legitimate? Okay. Keep getting ahead of the past here. All right, let's move forward then. Let's look at how Samuel rebukes Saul and Saul's rationalization. So, not only did Samuel come with the instruction for this battle, now he says, I have a follow-up conversation from God for you. I have a follow-up conversation, verse 13 of 1 Samuel. Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, "Blessed are you of the Lord." So these are Saul's words. "Blessed are you of the Lord, Samuel. Good to see you, my friend." What does he tell him? "I have carried out the command of the Lord." Samuel said, I had a question. "What then is the bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen which I hear?" Saul said, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen, sacrificed to the Lord your God, but the rest we have utterly destroyed." Then Samuel said, "Wait, and let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night." And he said to him, "Speak." Samuel said, "Is it not true that though you were little in your own eyes, you were made the head of the tribes of Israel? And the Lord anointed you king of Israel." Let's remember how you got to where you are, Saul. The Lord made you king. The Lord sent you on a mission. Remember? God has given you a task. Go and defeat and destroy the Amalekites. So God made you who you are, He gave you the role you have, and He gave you the task you have. Fight with them till they are exterminated, at the end of verse 18. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord, but rushed upon the spoil and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord? So look closely, take another look at verses 13 and 15, and then also we didn't read verses 20 and 21, but what excuses and rationalization do we see Saul giving for his disobedience? What's that? I did this for God. This sounds really spiritual, doesn't it? But God, I did this for you. Yeah, okay, I destroyed everything else. I know what I'm doing. What else? Wasn't me, God. Well, they did. God, why do you give me these people to work with, God? You remember in chapter 13, the thing we focused on was the blaming. Saul is not one to take ownership. He's not one to take responsibility. It's everyone else's fault. He's the victim in his own story all the time. The people did it, God. I don't know what they were doing, but we came up with a good plan. Okay, what else? Yeah, or my God. Yeah, yeah. So he's that's an indication of his spiritual condition. It's no longer a personal relationship he has with God that he's referring to. He's referring to this religious thing that we do. So let me ask you this: did Saul have any other option when the people decided that they wanted to keep the sheep? Let's take him at his word. The people decided they wanted to keep the sheep. They wanted to keep the oxen. They wanted to spare Agag. Did Saul have any other options? Well, let's let someone else go so we can give them a chance to, and then we'll come back. Okay. Okay. And so what could he have done then? We're headed back. Wait, there's a sheep there. There's a king there. I have no other options. Let's just go back. Here we go. What can he do? He could follow through, can he? He has the option. He's the king. What do you think prompted this? Money, greed. Chapter 13 we saw was this attitude of expedience or impatience. Here it appears to be greed. Look at verse 19 again. Samuel says to him, "Why did you not obey the voice of the Lord?" But what did he do? You rushed in on the spoil and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. That's an attitude or a perspective of deep selfishness. And interestingly enough, the verbs there are both singular. You rushed in is a you personally, is a you individually, not you as a group, not you as an army, not you as a nation, but you as a person, Saul. You rushed in. And the word did is also singular. You did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Not the people. I'm not pointing the finger at the people now, Saul. This is on you. This is on your shoulders. We see in verse 13, again, verse 20 that you looked at, Saul declares twice that he was obedient to God. Possibly. You and Gerstein stole my notes, man. All the straight up past my name. Oh, but I did open God on this percent where God Yep, he didn't do it. So let's jump ahead here, because we're running out of time. So we're looking at Samuel's rebuke, Samuel's rebuke of Saul, and this is the heart of it in verse 22. Look at this with me. Samuel said, "Has the Lord much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed the fat of rams. For rebellion is as of the sin of divination, and subordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." So God clearly has an order of priorities here, right? Yes, sacrifice is important to me, but what's more important to me? Obedience. Obedience. Do what I say. Your sacrifice is meaningless if you're not walking in obedience. The sacrificial system implemented in the Old Testament was never intended to be a substitute for an obedient life. Instead, it was a response of an obedient life. Sacrifice comes from a heart of obedience. It doesn't replace a heart of obedience. And it's meaningless outside the context of a right relationship with God. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for us? Here's one thing it means. It means it's possible for you to go through the motion of worship. We can do the same thing Saul did. We can go through the motions of worship while ignoring the reality of our own disobedience. We ignore the sin in our own life. We excuse it away. We shove it to the side. So God had made Saul king, and now he's taking that away. Samuel says, God has told me you will no longer have his blessing. And it wasn't God who changed. It wasn't God who changed Saul. That one, let's jump down here. At the end of this chapter, what we see is Samuel does what Saul should have done. He executes Agag as God had instructed. How is Samuel finally having to deal with Agag? How is that an example for us on how to deal with compromise? Don't compromise, okay? Deal harshly with sin. Take care of it right away the first time. Take care of it before it gets out of control. Right. That's guidance of the Holy Spirit. Sometimes there's a time to do it, time to to pray and to So there's wisdom in how we do it, but to do it, hold each other accountable. But sometimes it's easier to look at other people's shortcomings without looking at our own too, and that's kind of what I'm seeing here. Saul was real quick to look at Jonathan's shortcoming of eating honey when he was told not to. You must die for that. What? He didn't even know. Okay, How would you characterize the principles of obedience? What kind of principles on obedience? Okay. Which of those did Saul violate? Both? Okay. Which one do we see primarily here? Complete? Yeah. He went right to battle, so it's not like he delayed that, but it wasn't complete. Okay. So obedience in our attitude is just as important as our actions. You see, y'all sense a wrong attitude in Saul here. Does anyone else get that kind of feeling? We don't have a guy who's really seeking. Yeah, and we didn't even quite finish this chapter. We're going to touch on the end of this chapter next time, and as we look at chapter 16 too. Yeah, he goes downhill quickly, doesn't he? Yeah, I think we know the answer to this. How does God view partial obedience? Jubilee's answer. How does God view our rationalization, our excuses that we make? Does God say, I didn't realize. I'm glad you told me that you're having a rough day. I'm going to let your sin slide. Is there ever an excuse to sin? No. We always have the opportunity to say no to that wrong attitude, to that wrong comment. Yes. Every temptation we have, God makes a way of escape. Every time we have an opportunity, also an opportunity to say no. All right. There's 3 biblical principles I want to wrap up with tonight. Lifestyle. First one is the lifestyle of sin separates us from God and from those around us. What we see here in Saul's life at this stage of his life, we see him being separated, not only from God. That's really clear that he's separated himself from God. He stops seeking God. He stops obeying God. He turns away from God, starts doing his own thing in his own time. He doesn't have really any regard for God except when it's expedient or helpful to him on his terms. But we also see that his sin separates him from Samuel. He and Samuel, it tells us, never cross paths again. They don't ever come together again. His army no longer trusts him. He's the leader. He's the king of this army, and they no longer trust him. He's broken his relationship with his son, and there's a huge wedge there because of his sin. Would that drive a wedge between you and your dad if your dad's like, I might kill you? Okay, and that would be that would put a damper on it, right? Okay, imagine being Jonathan here. You must die, and the whole army rises up and says, "No, this is stupid." Okay. The second principle: our sin patterns aren't isolated to us. When we give into sin, it impacts future generations. Exodus 34 tells us that sin of one generation, the effects of that and the consequences of that impact future generations. It says God visits the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the grandchildren, third, fourth generation. Your sin doesn't just affect you. It's going to affect your kids and your children's children and generations to come. Be wise. The Amalekites of Saul's day were facing judgment because of the actions of their ancestors hundreds of years earlier. And they still had not repented of the sin. Does that mean a cycle can never be broken? Well, my dad, my grandpa were jerks, and therefore God's going to get me. I don't have a choice. No. We see plenty of times where that cycle is broken. Did Rahab stay and die with all the other people of Jericho? No. That cycle can be broken. That cycle can be changed. But the pattern is that those patterns are handed down from generation to generation. Sin will continue to happen. Jonathan will never serve as king because of the sin of his father. He would have made a pretty good king, it seems like, from what we see. And then the last principle I have for you is a quote from John Wesley. There is no little sin. There's no such thing as, oh, that was just a little sin. There is no little sin because there is no little God sin. So what we consider a small sin is not really a small sin. It's still rebellion against God. Here's kind of a sum up of this chapter, these chapters. We can't ever adopt a casual attitude about sin. Can't ever get comfortable with sin because there is no sin. All right, well, let's pray together. Father, thank you for your love for us. Thank you for being a patient God, but also a just God. Thank you for being a merciful God, but also a God who brings judgment as a God who has standards and doesn't accept human rationalization. So we can have confidence you are unchanged. That your standard is right and your standard will not change. So we don't have to try to guess what you expect of us. You expect us to turn our life. You expect us to turn our hearts. And you expect us to live for you. You don't have to guess about what it's thankful. Love us enough to spell that out. Now